Okay, so this week we're roughly where we are in the schedule. We're on self-paced reading times. Okay, so generally speaking, I have gently pushed you guys away from doing this for this class because it takes a little bit more planning, I would say. But if you ever see it in an article or long term, you magically need to do it. This is really interesting. Plus, this is, I think, sort of a special window into certain parts of language that even if you're not specifically going to do this research, I think it's informative about how language works to see this. So, self-paced reading times. It falls under the category of processing. Now, some of you are in Linguistics 423 right now, and there's some connections you're going to see in this particular section. But let's say self-paced reading times. The acronym, it looks like SPRT, which is nice. But or sometimes if you just take out and talk, well, the self-paced reading something, you'll say SPR by itself, but SPRTs are SPR. Anyway, self-paced reading times. This is our first psycholinguistic task that we're looking at in this course. We're going to talk next week about eye tracking, and the week after that is technically neurolinguistics, and we do ERPs. Neurolinguistics is a cousin of psycholinguistics, just has brain scanning involved. But psycholinguistics is a study of processing, aka of real-time language use. Okay, so we want to see language in motion. There are two major types of processing: sentence planning, which has to do with real-time production. It's not researched nearly enough. It's one of the things that I think Dana has some passion about and makes her research paradigm unique. But also parsing, which is very important and much, much more studied, is real-time sort of comprehension and also interpretation. And we'll see in a second a little bit more about that because that's what self-paced reading is about, parsing. Now, self-paced reading as a measure of parsing, you have to keep in mind in parsing what we're doing is assigning a structure, a syntactic tree, because they're everywhere in some sense, to language in our environment. We need that structure, actually, to understand the relationships in the sentence. And in fact, its structure is what tells me who is the subject of that sentence. Without it, I don't know the difference between a subject and an object, right? In English, we use word order, but the word order is reflecting the structure. In some languages, it's marked by morphology, but that morphology gets its, obtains, as it were, due to underlying relationships, right? Due to its hierarchy. So parsing is about imposing structure on language. Otherwise, we wouldn't understand it. So the structure that we assign is based upon expectation, right? What we think is going to happen next. Because sort of we talk about, there's top-down parsing and sort of what they call bottom-up. Bottom-up is like when we built a tree, I have a verb and I have a noun and I go smush. Okay, so now I have a little VP. That VP needs a subject. I'll add another layer. This is actually a V-bar, and I add a subject. Boop, now I got a VP. And you go smush, 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 smush. Traditional building of a tree is considered bottom-up because you're merging and creating structure above it, right? And we build trees in our mind. The idea is if we were going to create a tree, we would be building it from the bottom up. Now, if I'm listening to you talk and I'm parsing it and I'm trying to impose structure upon it, I don't have that option because I'm going to hear what's high in the tree first. And so parsing has a top-down thing going on, right? I have to kind of, it's like grabbing, you ever seen a ladder made of rope? It's like grabbing a ladder made of rope and I have to make a guess how long that ladder has to be, kind of. And I kind of throw it out and hopefully I have enough rungs. And so it's kind of like that. And then we kind of try to hang words in the right spot of the tree. We're kind of guessing about how big that tree is, in a sense, And in a way, as we learn things about the sentence, the verb and whatnot, we also start kind of building it the traditional way at the same time. So this is top down, where I'm kind of guessing by throwing out kind of my rope ladder where the tree is going to be. And also bottom up at the same time. But because I'm guessing and throwing out that ladder, it's incremental. I have to add stuff to it and go, oh, okay, I'll add this, and I'll add that. But, it's also prone to mistakes, essentially, right? And we need things called reanalysis. So, let's pull that, put up a different ladder. in order to account for those sort of oopses, right? But the fact that I have to base it on expectation, it's incremental, little by little by little. That was part of the quiz questions, right? So if I hear John thinks, so if someone's talking to me, or if I read it, but in this case we're just talking about here, they could be signing it at me, of course, as well. If I get the input John thinks, in English, my brain goes, well, certain kind of words are going to follow thinks. And this is based on expectation. This is based a little bit on frequency. Parsing plays a lot around frequency, because how are you going to have expectations if it's not the common thing? But it's not just frequency. It's also what the structure that thinks usually brings with it. And think many times takes a clause or complement. So I'm expecting certain kinds of words, probably a clause starting with that, or maybe without the that, right? John thinks that you're very smart, right? Whereas, if I hear, John eats, my brain's not expecting that. I'm expecting words that are very different from think. My rope ladder looks different for eats and thinks, right? I think thinks is going to need a whole other class. I got a really long one. It's a 3rd-story window ladder. But if I hear John eats, I might throw them about 4 rungs down. I'm like, I just need another noun. Cool, right? Now, one application of self-paced reading that, if you are in 423 this semester, it's going to sound familiar, is active filler. Maybe they don't call it that, but and the idea is that for WH movement is a formation of questions with what or who or those kind of words at the beginning. For WH movement, we assume that some WH word starts in the lower part of the sentence and raises to the spec of CP. And as I say in English, it looks like it starts down in like an object position or something like that and moves up to the top of the tree. Okay? Some examples. What did John read? We assume it started out John read what? Right? Echo questions, you can see where it started. What did you say that John read? You said that John read what? So we assume that what started lower. Okay? The active filler is the desire of the parser to figure out where that what came from, okay, or whatever your WH word is, right? So we're constantly looking for the source of WH word. This is the active filler hypothesis. If parsing is based on expectation, which it is, right, we could expect it in any number of places where the what could have started from, right? This is going to sound kind of weird until you see an example. So let's look at this, okay? This is one of the ways that self-paced reading can look. This is a fixation cross and a little plus in the middle of the screen. And so the participant's supposed to look at the fixation cross, because if it's all white besides that, because what about this example? This is my title because this is a class, not because this is what you would see. But it's a fixation cross. And then you're supposed to look at that cross and it's replaced by the first word. So what we're going to do is we're going to read a sentence, one word at a time. This is the non-cumulative version. Cumulative would mean that the words kind of accumulate across the screen, sometimes replaced by stars. But this is non-cumulative. It's one word at a time in the middle of the screen. Okay, we're going to read a sentence, and I want you to, you could raise your hand literally. I'm not there with you. Do whatever you want. Clap, snap, think to yourself. All the places where the what could have started from, okay? Ready? Okay, so I don't know about you, but I found 2 places that the what could have come from, right? So we were reading the sentence, what book did you read? And then my brain goes, hey, is what book starting here? Okay. And this is D-link, so what book came together, right? And then you get another word. So what book did you read? Oh, Anne. It's not going to be there. So your brain goes, nope, and it has to reanalyze. It goes, that's not quite the right rope ladder. Let's throw a new one. Okay? So you keep reading. And article about, and you go, well, about takes a noun after it. So is what book down here? And then you hit yesterday, and you go, yep, that was the spot. Okay? Because there's no other noun there. So that's where my what started. Yeah, the typical notation looks like this. We have a little T for where it starts, right? And we cross it out, and then we confirmed it down here. And that T is called a trace. There's a couple notations, but right now this version isn't T. It could easily be copies, doesn't make a difference. But anyway, T, and I'm going to call it a trace, but that basically is the origin, where it started, okay? All right, so here we're seeing some simulated reading time data, okay? We're pretending that we're doing this data. Now, instead of doing it word by word, I'm doing it in critical regions, which is another way to do this. You could have done what we did before, except for it would show, what book did you read? An article about over the weekend, right? Could be. So we're going to do it in 4 critical regions, which you could totally do. Now, I've now taken reading times for one person, or a bunch of people, let's say, across these 4 regions. Now, you're seeing it kind of goes, okay? This is what you would hypothetically see for this sentence, and I'll tell you why. The participant expects a trace after the word read, okay? Because if all you see is what book did you read, your brain goes, well, read takes a noun. Why wouldn't it be what book? Yeah. However, the sentence keeps going. And since it keeps going, it takes a second for your mind, your parser, to go, okay, I need a different rope ladder. And it takes a split second, here it's an extra 200, 250 milliseconds. These are milliseconds-ish on the left side. It takes an extra 250 milliseconds to go, oh, okay, that's not right. Let's try a new one. It's your brain going, shoot, that's the wrong ladder. Pull that up. Throw something else down. Okay? This is what's happening in parsing when you have to reanalyze. And so what you see is an increase in the reading time in the next region. Okay? And this is how reading time data works. You don't get increases at the part where it disambiguates. You get an increase in reading time either the very next region or the region after that. These are called spillover regions. Okay? They're places after sort of the disambiguating critical region. That's critical region's technical term. And where the places afterwards where you're actually going to see the changes in reading time. And spillover region is also a technical term. Okay? So when would I use self-paced reading? When is that helpful to me? When would I use spurts? People actually do occasionally say occasionally. Anyway, self-paced reading is useful. Reading is useful when you want to know whether people have reanalysis in their reading. So what we just saw, what book did you read an article about yesterday? We can see that our brain expected there to be what book after read, because we get a slowdown in the next region, or around there. We also can use it to look at things called garden paths, which you may or may not have talked about before. If I read the sentence 6 from left to right, my brain is going to go, partway through, and I am going to have to sit there and pick out a new ladder. And these are classic sentences that cause a large reanalysis, because the idea is that you end up going down one path in the garden and it dead ends, and then you have to come back up the path to go out the other one. As to say, they cause relatively strong crashes in parsing. So 6, the log floated down the river, sank. Which maybe doesn't even sound like a sentence to you. But basically, it's the smushing of the log floated down the river and the log sank. And in fact, to make this happen, it has to be the log that was floated down the river. Because in order to have that relative clause look like that, it has to be passive, right? The log that was floated down the river by somebody sank, is what it means under the surface. But you can say the log floated down the river, sank. If I use intonation, it's a little easier. But when I'm reading, I don't have any of that. So when I get to sank, my brain goes, what? Huh? And sometimes I never recover. I mean, garden paths you don't always recover from. Sometimes it just crashes altogether. Okay? Another place you might use self-paced reading, which we haven't talked a lot about, but it's really interesting and probably the most common usage. I mean, WH stuff gets done for sure, but this other thing is kind of a little more common. So I'm going to show you 2. What you're trying to do is see if people are citing the structure that you would expect them to be using. This is really useful when you have bilinguals or second language learners, and or children, and they're doing things you don't expect. So I'm going to show you 2 examples. They're going to be similar, except for there's going to be a gender difference. And one of them triggers a reanalysis, okay? So Susan smiled at Martin while scratching herself in the wrist, okay? You're envisioning someone sitting there smiling at someone else, itching their wrist for a second. Like, ah, hi, basically, right? This one, Susan smiled at Martin while scratching himself on the wrist. Should not sound perfect to you, right? Because honestly, the antecedent to the anaphor has to be the subject, and for it to be Martin is not good. So we used this kind of procedure with like either a gender disambiguation. Sometimes we try to do it with number to kind of force a particular reading on the listener, to the reader, to the, in theory, the sign receiver, but that's been done very, very little. Certainly in reading it wouldn't work. Anyway, and then because you can kind of measure if you're getting the appropriate sort of registration of errors here. The person goes, himself? It's supposed to happen when they're reading 7, essentially. And so we use this to kind of see if learners are sensitive to errors. We use to see if bilinguals are processing gender in the same way, where there are times where the choice is, let's say, ambiguous, and you use it to force a reading. If you have 423 this week and you saw my relative clause attachment class for that, or I guess you could look at it on YouTube if you're not in that class, you can use gender to force one of the two readings in relative clause attachment. And then if their natural inclination is the other reading, you'll see effects. Okay. So anyway, you can also check for if people are using the structure that you would expect, right? So in 6 and 7, 6 but not 7, the anaphor correctly agrees with the subject. So in 7, you would get a whoa horsey thing. Okay? All right, so self-paced reading times are fun and different. They require reading, they require a written language. There are ways to kind of use parsing in other modalities, but this particular one is about reading. If you have questions in this, let me know. Otherwise, have a great weekend.